Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. February 1927 has one main story, but man, is it a doozy. We covered a college co-ed from Texas back in December and have followed up since, but now we have a copycat. So we're going to go over her story. And just like we did with Rebecca Rodgers from Texas, we're going to actually try to figure out ourselves if she is even fit to stand trial. Since the story takes place in South Dakota, it's fitting that we first reference the Bismarck Tribune. And with that, we turn to its February 5, 1927 edition. The title of their story was Girl Student of South Dakota University Arrested for Alleged Attempt to Rob National Bank at Vermilion. As if that wasn't enough, it was subtitled, Electric Drill Set Up, Ready to Operate When Girl Was Frightened Away by Night Watchman, Says Cashier. So we meet Marion Myers, who is our South Dakota University co-ed become bank robber. According to this article, she was 19 or 20 and hailed from Valley City, North Dakota, was in the class of 1930. That was when she was going to graduate. Myers was arrested on February 5th for allegedly attempting to rob the First National Bank at Vermilion. A P.M. Hayter, Hayter, was the cashier of the bank, and he said that an electric drill had been set up and was ready to go when Myers was frightened away. Vermilion night watchman Denny Sullivan apparently entered the bank early on February 5th, and he was going to start up the furnace fire to warm the building up. It was believed that that is what frightened away the, quote, pretty burglar before she could drill into the vault, end quote. Apparently, according to this article, Myers had climbed into the bank through a rear window. Well, interestingly, a few days prior to the robbery attempt, an electric drill and a number of bits were stolen from an area garage, and that seemed to match that of those used by Myers. Oddly, and I mean oddly, in a rush to escape, Myers left behind a man's hat with her name on it. When captured, Myers pleaded with authorities that her mother be kept, quote, in ignorance, end quote, saying, quote, it will kill her, don't tell her, end quote. Well, Myers added, I need the money oh so badly, and my mother is not well and has all she can do to support herself. Where else could I get the money, end quote. She told authorities that she had planned the robbery over a week's time, and added that she stole the tools from the garage, quote, last Monday night. That probably meant January 31st. She added that she had watched the men at a garage using a drill in order to learn how to use it herself, though the article didn't state whether it was at the garage from which she stole the drill and bits or a different one. Now for a kicker. A Mr. Perkins apparently declared that the girl, quote, had been reading about the Texas University girl who held up a bank, end quote. According to Perkins, that made the idea possible in Myers' mind. Well, at this point, who is Mr. Perkins? It would be nice to know for the context for this statement to make sense. We'll clear up a lot more as we go along. The article's author stated that she was relatively tight-lipped, although she's already had 4 or 5 quotes. Myers was noted to say, quote, I thought I could get into the bank unnoticed and take just the $24 I needed for tuition, end quote. The allegedly tight-lipped Myers continued, then I planned to return it later and no one would have been the loser, end quote. Fittingly, she added that that was the first time she, quote, ever done anything wrong, and the last two, end quote. We'll see. So because modern women doing wrong was pretty juicy back then, as frankly, in a way it is today, the Tribune ran a second contiguous story with lots of rehashing of the same information, but it did help add a little bit of detail. Number one, the money from this attempted heist, that $24, was going to pay for her second semester at the University of South Dakota. They noted that Myers was a freshman, which fits with her being about 19, and fits with her being in the class of 1930. After being frightened away, she actually returned to get the tools which she'd left behind. At that point, it appears that she recognized that the crime had been discovered, leading police to find her seated on a stairway at the rear of the building in the midst of a crying jag. Perkins, as it turns out, was state's attorney H.O. Perkins, who confirmed that she was in fact stealing the money to pay for tuition for college. Mrs. Myers, the mother, lived in Woonsocket, South Dakota, according to Marion Myers, but her father was deceased. While attending the university, she was living at the home of Professor of Philosophy C.C. Josie, that's Josey, and was working at the house in exchange for board. This article clarified that she indeed entered the bank around 5 a.m. by breaking the rear window to gain access. Then she somehow broke through a heavy cage door leading to the vault. She then attached the electric drill to a light socket, but found that the cord was too short, so she ended up pulling that and moved to a socket that was closer to the vault. She even apparently cut the telegraph wire in the alley behind the bank and the telephone lines associated with the bank. So this is clearly thought out. Myers' friends who, quote, declared she was earnestly desirous of an education, end quote, couldn't explain why she attempted the heist. Now, here is the first dose of sexism, which isn't a surprise back then. Quote, police have found nothing to substantiate their first surmise that the girl had male accomplices, end quote. However, State's Attorney Perkins was, quote, convinced the girl had male accomplices, end quote, despite the fact that Myers denied that categorically. At the time, she was held in jail in the women's ward, pending further investigation and then the filing of formal charges. She was the only prisoner there and apparently spent a lot of her time in tears. Well, Perkins acquiesced to her plea that he not tell her mother if she told him who her accomplices were. She continued to deny having accomplices. Now, in support of State's Attorney Perkins' line of thinking, the telegraph wires being cut may have required strength or skill that a young woman would possibly not have possessed at the time. And like Perkins, I wondered how she forced her way through the heavy-duty cage to get to the vault. But, per the Tribune, she was, quote, rather short, weighs about 125 pounds, but is quite muscular. They went on to add her hair color being light brown, and Perkins termed her, quote, rather good-looking, end quote. She apparently dressed well for the heist. The men's hat that bore her name, she was known to wear that on campus occasionally, and it sounds like something a freshman or sophomore might do in college, just being free to explore and act out. So maybe that's what she was up to with the hat. Well, her preliminary hearing was going to be Monday or later, since it was the weekend, since we're still here on Saturday, February 5th. But now in a peculiar twist, shortly following Myers' arrest, several women employees from the Grange store visited her room where she was staying, where she was boarding, and found several dresses that they identified as having been stolen from the store, quote, last October, end quote, and apparently they had suspected her all along. So despite her pleas that this was the first and last time she would ever do anything wrong, it's possible that she'd already done something wrong by stealing these dresses. Well, since the story is starting to get juicier, it's fitting that there was a third story in that same edition of the Bismarck Tribune. Enter Mama Myers. Mrs. Myers, M.L. Myers, from her home in Woonsocket, South Dakota. Quote, that wasn't my girl. My girl wouldn't do anything like that, end quote. Mrs. Myers also noted that she had a sick son who was in a Huron hospital. Presumably that's Huron, South Dakota. In a complete lapse of operational security, or OPSEC, they noted that Mrs. Myers, in the newspaper, would leave for Vermilion on the earliest possible train. Hopefully no burglars were reading that and thinking this might be a good time to hit Mrs. M.L. Myers' house. So all that information in all three stories from paper number 1 of 17. But never fear, we're going to scan through the other editions for more details and discrepancies and clarifications, because there's plenty of it. Such as from the Indianapolis Times from the same day as the Tribune, lots of discrepancies. Their story was titled, Pretty Co-ed Caught Trying to Rob Bank, and was subtitled, Girl 19 Entered Place Before Opening Hour, Cord Short to Serve Electric Drill. Here are some differences from all those stories in the Tribune. The Indianapolis Times stated that Myers was apprehended by the night watchman as she waited in the bank for the doors to open so she could surrender. 2, Myers allegedly said that her mother, quote, could not afford to have the daughter continue at the university, so she planned the robbery, end quote. 3, allegedly she took the drill, some pliers and other tools, apparently the bits as well, and climbed through an open back window as opposed to having broken the window. 4, importantly, she admitted to the other robbery. Allegedly, she went into the Ford Motor Company, quote, last night, that would be Feb 4, and took the drills, plural, and other tools according to Perkins. However, Perkins stated that Myers was lying about that since the automobile company noted the missing drill last Tuesday, and the other implements didn't vanish until last night. So this is very confusing, and you would think there's some basic facts that they should be able to figure out. What tools were stolen from where? When were they stolen? Was the window broken or not? Point 5. As I stated regarding the Texas co-ed robber and our recent run-in with some white-collar crooks, Myers, because she's female, was being looked at differently already. Perkins, quote, indicated it was up to the bank official to say what should be done, end quote. So were they going to handle a 19-year-old male the same way? Or is it because she's a 19-year-old female? Or are there other characteristics that are involved in this story? Well, the Brownsville Herald ran a Feb 5 story with basically the same AP information, and the Imperial Valley Press ran basically the same info as well. The press, however, referred to the night watchman as Dennis Sullivan, not Denny Sullivan, and referred to him as a police officer. So when we think night watchman, we might think of a guard, but in that sense, they meant he was a police officer who was patrolling at night. Why it was the police officer's job to start the furnace at the bank, I'm not sure. According to the Imperial Valley Press, Sullivan discovered Myers in the act, but didn't arrest her, instead got bank officials to come to the bank, not other police officers. Then supposedly the officials walked in on Myers in the act. You would think on one story there couldn't be this many different interpretations of facts, but there are. The next day's Sunday Star used the Associated Press story, but restructured it with very well-written prose. Just one example of that. Quote, her courage gone, broken, and racked by sobs. She cried herself to sleep tonight in the county jail, end quote. Very dramatic. It's the same thing that was said before. She was in jail, she was in the women's ward, and she was crying. The Star referred to Sullivan as a patrolman, and it was apparently Sullivan and another police officer who discovered Myers outside, not inside. They did add some helpful insights. According to Professor C.C. Josie, allegedly he stated she had always been a little, quote, queer, but he had no criticism of her previous work or behavior. Of course, queer meaning odd or unusual back then. Josie didn't think that Myers had any boyfriends or boyfriends. Not only did she not have boyfriends, but she didn't seem to have close relationships with any boys or girls. And, quote, he insisted on her being in the house by 10 or 10:30 each night, end quote. The Douglas Daily Dispatch added nothing new, but the February 7 Evening Star added some updates via an Associated Press story titled Mother Comforts Co-ed Burglar. It appeared that Myers was, quote, more cheerful today as she faced a third-degree burglary charge for this bank heist attempt. Well, at this point, it looks like Myers has signed a confession after which her mother had arrived from a Woonsocket. Mrs. Myers seemed confused as to why her girl would try robbing the bank, since she'd sent her daughter $6 per week to help out. That information directly confronts what Marion Myers herself said about her mother not having money. Apparently, Mrs. Myers had experienced a string of bad luck, including her husband's death, though that was 9 years ago, her young son being ill in that Huron, South Dakota hospital for the past 3 years, and now this robbery by her daughter gone wrong. Despite not having money for a lawyer, she hoped that the judge would, quote, be kind to her daughter, end quote. So the details of this robbery attempt are starting to filter together and sort of make sense, and a picture of Marion Myers is also starting to form. According to students at the university, confirming what Josie said, Myers didn't have close friends. Additionally, she was often morose and, quote, frequently was crying when she came to classes in the morning, end quote. So was Myers depressed? Did losing her father those 9 years ago and then having her brother ill in the hospital contribute to possibly a weakened mental state? Both of those are very prominent events, especially if we have to remember she would have been 10 when her father died, and she would have only been 16 when her brother became ill and was put in the hospital. On top of everything else, it was noted that the penalty for third-degree burglary in South Dakota was not more than 15 years in the penitentiary. A few more details on the actual heist attempt. Myers left the home of Professor Josie early Friday evening, waited in the post office in a restroom, and hid out, I guess, until about 1 a.m., then entered the bank through the back window. Well, and now they introduced a few more points of confusion on this heist attempt. Since she allegedly couldn't get into the main room of the bank, she went into an adjoining garage where she stole the pliers, drill bits, screwdriver, which she apparently used to jimmy her way into the room. This goes against everything else we've already learned about the two potential garages from which she stole the tools, and the two different timelines during which she stole the tools. But luckily, the Imperial Valley Press followed up and ran a UP, United Press story, and introduced two new bits of information. One, bond was being set at $1,500, but most likely she wouldn't have been able to, quote, furnish the bail. And the trial was going to be heard at some point, most likely in March. Well, the Indianapolis Times ran a story replete with photo titled "Co-ed Bank Bandits Sanity Questioned." It seemed that authorities were wondering if Myers should remain in the county jail or be, quote, removed to the state hospital at Yankton, end quote, for observation. The County Insanity Commission ordered Myers to be taken to that hospital, but Perkins, State Attorney Perkins, did not want to acquiesce. If the Douglas Daily Dispatch is correct, the Insanity Commission won out because Myers was declared, quote, insane when she tried to rob the bank at Vermilion. State's Attorney Perkins demanded that the $1,500 bond had to be furnished before Myers could leave for the hospital. And the local sheriff, James Partridge, concurred. Myers' attorney, C.J. Cunderson, however, was in favor of the decision. Of course he was. Well, the Daily Alaska Empire decided to forgo facts or finesse, I guess, instead going straight for what comes across kind of as a trashy article. It's hard enough dealing with 17 papers and the fact that none of them agree on basic facts. Add to it that the Daily Alaska Empire noted that Myers had, quote, looted the Vermilion Bank and did it for a, quote, thrill, end quote, and was now on her way to the state hospital for the insane. A very short article full of lurid brandishes. She didn't loot the bank, and she didn't seem to do it for a thrill. She claimed she was doing it for $24 for college. Well, the February 9, 1927 Washington Times added even more spice with a photo of Myers under the title, "Another Co-ed Joins Bandit Ranks," and subtitled it, "Marion Myers is Watched by Alienist," which is really cool. It's an old term for the new burgeoning science of psychology. So an alienist was a mental health worker, as we would say today, a psychiatrist, psychologist. Well, they nicely tied together the Texas heist we covered in December of 1926 with this Myers debacle. And for our second time, we even get to tap into the German language paper, the Arkansas Echo. Roughly translated, this story about Myers says that in Vermilion, South Dakota, 19-year-old college student Marion Myers attempted to get money by breaking into the bank. Where it says Sie murder dabei erwischt, it looks like we think murder, but it's not. That sentence, Sie murder dabei erwischt, translates to she was caught in the act. Claiming she only wanted to get $24 to pay for tuition. She was driven insane, or she was determined to be insane, something to that effect, and was taken to the state orphanage, meaning mental health hospital, for observation. And so we come full circle, at least for February of 1927, returning back to the Bismarck Tribune with its February 22nd, 1927 edition. Apparently, the superintendent, Dr. G.S. Adams, was denying that Myers had been found sane, noting the report wasn't complete. He noted the report will be submitted to the circuit court in Clay County on March 7th. So clearly, we'll have to wait until March 7th or beyond for more updates on Myers. Questions. Will she be found sane or insane? Will she indeed be sentenced up to 15 years? Or will she be handled differently based on her sex, but also her age? Hopefully we'll get more on her and her Texas compatriot, Rebecca Bradley Rodgers, soon. I think we will in March. For now, we're going to wrap up February and move on to what is shaping up to be both a quirky but violent March 1927. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye, bye, blackbird.